Right, let's get going. Good morning, everybody. Sorry to cut your coffee short. This is a brainstorming. You should be part of this right from the get-go. We've got 2 hours between now and just before 1 o'clock. We have a panel. They're going to react and also give their own views about which way things will go with Russia. Already our foreign minister has said he takes issue with the idea of a Russian bear awaking. Let's just call this Russia Scenarios and Strategy. And therefore, I'm going to come to you shortly, before we even hear from the panel, and ask you what you think needs to be on the agenda. Because you also have ideas, and then we will get responses from those on the panel and others in the room about what is feasible, what is practical, how bleak things are, and therefore what has to be done in order to make sure that, that there is a clarity of direction of travel given the severity which we've heard about. And we heard from the President this morning, President Kiska, beyond those weeks of hope and doubt that Crimea was an aberration. We've now moved on from that a year ago. He said, we must prepare for years of instability, but we need to protect our citizens. Our goal on Russia, Russia destroying the unity of the European Union by sowing confusion. And we're seeing that at the moment, at this very moment, happening in St. Petersburg at the economic summit, the kind of Russian Davos, particularly with the Greeks being very active there. Tony Blair is there, but there are no other Western leaders apart from the Greeks. And the President said this morning, we're at the limits of our pragmatism. Our future depends on our ability to adapt to the new reality. So we must define the new reality and the new scenarios. So that's the challenge for you. And I'm saying this now because either through the app or in person in the next couple of hours, and immediately after the first intervention, which I'll come to in a moment, I would like you to set the agenda and what you think we should be thinking about, and they can respond on the platform. In a moment, too, we're going to hear from Bruce Stokes. You heard from Sandy Veshpal, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, yesterday about the disconcerting data that Pew has just produced on public opinion about what NATO should do given the Russian threat. And we've been hearing certainly from President Ilves this morning about what's going on across their border is a matter of deep concern. 70,000, 80,000 troops, or 4 times 20, depending on how you want to define it, what that really means. But how this is now being read by public opinion in the 28 nations of NATO, in the nations of the European Union, and indeed in the nations which are not members of the European Union, but can also be affected by the Russian challenge at the moment. You will all have your own definitions of what this challenge is. But we've now got to look forward, and Bruce is going to give some data on what public opinion is saying, particularly after Sandy Veshpal did say this is now disconcerting data. He said elites must drive home now to their publics what is important when it comes to understanding Russian intentions. So create your agenda, use the doc, the app, and give me also some ideas after we've heard from the first bit of this session, which is only going to last 3 or 4 minutes. It is 10 years. You can see it all around you. 10 years since the start of GLOBSEC. I've been delighted to be involved for the last 2 years. But Pavel is going to come and, Pavel Demis is going to highlight a new book which has come out. It's a new pamphlet, really, just highlighting the achievements so far of GLOBSEC and where it's been and where it's going. Pavel, the floor is yours. There you go.
Thank you very much, Nick. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I've been to all 10 GLOBSECs, and I'm very glad that I was able to prepare with the young team of Robert Vash and Milan Solar this publication, which all of you can pick at Infodesk. It's both in English, and we'll have it in Slovak. It will be available also on internet. But at this stage, I just wanted to say that this is, we call the publication the phenomenon of GLOBSEC, because this is for Slovakia, but I believe for all of you, not only a conference. We believe that GLOBSEC evolved from student type of conference to gathering of this size, where people from around the world are coming together and in very sincere atmosphere are able to discuss challenges of the world. So publication is about story, how it started, about youngsters who developed this, and about contemporary challenges which the world is facing. In Slovakia, we have a funny habit that we are baptizing books, bringing it like newborn to life, and usually we either pour water or some other liquids, but today we decided to do it with sand from the largest river of Europe, Danube, which has spring in Germany and flows up to Black Sea. And I would like to ask Zuzana, because usually women must be attached to this ceremony, and ask recipient of Transatlantic Award, Carl Bildt, who is great friend of GLOBSEC and all of us, one of the brave leaders on international community, if he would help us to introduce the book with sand from the river of Danube, and then all of you are welcome to pick it downstairs and read it. Carl. Zuzana.
There are, of course, some habits that are European, some that are slightly less European. But they could become European, so you now see it for the first time, the new European habit of throwing sands at new books.
Thank you.
But it's a great book, and it's a great story, and I hope that the sand doesn't do too much damage to it. It's from the
I was digging it in the morning.
Do you know what the Austrians have done to this?
Don't drink it.
Now it is
Oh,
baptized
thank you.
in, if not fire, then in sand.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
Okay, we can go.
Never.
We like to put grit in the argument.
Oh, no.
Pavel, have you finished?
Yes.
Do you want to, would you like to throw sand at anybody else?
No.
Thank you very much. We like to lighten the load, given the seriousness of what we're going to be discussing now. Let me introduce our panel. We have the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Lithuania, Mr. Linkevičius. We have Carl Bildt, who until last year was Foreign Minister of Sweden. And we have Sergei Aleksashenko, who is a former Deputy Minister of Finance for Moscow. So we have a real rainbow there of views about where the challenges are on Moscow and Russia. Let me ask you, I've given you notice, you've had 5 minutes to think about it. What do we need to put on the agenda? Anyone burning to say something at this stage? Help us set the agenda for the next 1 hour and 45 minutes. We have someone from the World Service, place I used to work. If tomorrow Russian troops move towards Kiev, do you believe NATO will or can declare war on Moscow? Shall we just call it Article 5 for the moment? So that's one question. Anyone else want to put anything on the agenda? We can create the agenda for you, but what about other issues which are on your mind? Help us understand. Any hands? No other thoughts? Please, Ed Lucas. Microphone here, microphone over there. This is your opportunity. This is a brainstorming. It is a conversation. So it's not just a panel talking to you. Microphone there first, please, Michael.
Yes, Thomas Armlavičius,
Sorry, I beg your pardon, Thomas. Yeah.
Yeah. Just a quick sort of scenario.
Make it
ponder
quick.
perhaps. Collapse, disintegration, failure of Russia. How do we deal with that?
Collapse of Russia, please, there. Microphone along, and then there, please.
Philip Blond, Res Publica. What are the genuine red lines in Ukraine for the EU, for America, and for the Ukrainians? Because I suspect they're all different.
Right, the gentleman over there, you've got the microphone. Keep the microphone moving, please.
Relations between Russia and non-Western powers, not just China, but others, India and Israel, even others.
All right, move the microphone down there. And Ed Lucas here. Have you got the microphone there? Okay, who's the microphone is moving faster than I can keep up with it. Please, Elena.
Can I use the opportunity? Thank you. Should we engage with the Eurasian Union as an opportunity also to extend leverage over Russia? Thank you.
The Asian Union. Okay, who else has got the microphone?
Yeah,
please?
I've got it. Roland Freudenstein, the Martin Center in Brussels. Russia post-Putin. I mean, is it better? Is it worse? How are we going to deal with it?
Okay, who's got it next, please? Please, give the microphone to somebody else.
2 points. How to cancel Minsk 2. agreement, and second, whether it's no non-military solution to the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Say that again. No.
No non-military solution.
Okay, move the microphone forward, please.
There's another one here.
Yep. Wait a minute, here first.
I would like just to touch upon permanent NATO presence in NATO's eastern flank as a deterrence measure. Thank you.
Okay, Ed Lucas.
A slightly different point. What can we do to show the Russian people that our quarrel is not with them, but with their regime?
Okay, have you got the microphone?
Yeah, Charles Sanek, why is the West so unwilling to supply the Ukrainian armed forces and its legitimate government with the means to defend itself militarily?
Okay, please, to the lady there.
If Putin will make full-scale aggression towards Ukraine, what will be the reaction of the NATO countries and the EU member states?
Okay, a gentleman here, please. Who's got the microphone next? I'll come to you in a moment. Who's got it here, please?
Could we also discuss the rapprochement between Moscow and Ankara?
Okay,
The relations
Moscow and Ankara.
Putin and Erdogan.
Right, let's go to David Andrew, who comes from Australia. And you've got views about what needs to be thought about. You're representing the young global leaders.
Yes, that's correct. There's two particular things we've spoken about within our group, which is, for one, the use of sanctions we would consider as a tactic rather than a strategy. So talking about what bigger strategies can be used in terms of reducing the impacts of Russian aggression towards Ukraine and Crimea, but also looking beyond Putin in that he is, as we all are, just a man and he will at one point die. So what's coming next, and I suppose thinking about us as young leaders, who are the equivalent young leaders in Russia? How can we reach out to them and engage with them and try and shape the future of Russia post the present regime?
Okay, this is a very broad spectrum and landscape we're creating. I'll take up to 10 more.
Thank
I'm
you.
counting.
Thank you, Fred Tanner from the OSCE.
Say it again, Fred, please.
Fred Tanner from the OSCE. Question, what needs to happen that we can re-engage with Russia? We don't want to have a divided Europe. What can be done? Thank you.
All right, please, the microphone back to the lady there. And who's got the microphone over here? Please.
Yes, David Kadir, London School of Economics. Are EU sanctions on Russia working in changing Russian policy?
Okay, and you've got the microphone.
I'm from the BMW Foundation in Berlin, and I would like to ask a question about synchronization between the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Eurasian economic space, and where does this leave Europe? Thank you.
Right, let's move the microphone to the Japanese ambassador in Brussels.
Masaishi, how to coordinate the policy towards Russia in Asia as well as in Europe, because Russia is always bear with two heads.
Okay. Who's got the microphone next? Over there, please.
I am Martin Ugroshi from Hungary, and I was wondering if it's possible to keep the EU together.
Keep
the EU position together, as large member states like Italy are also reaching out for Russia.
Okay. Who else, please? You're self-selecting. Whoever grabs the microphone. Let's go to the gentleman at the back. This is not a gimmick. What I'm trying to do is find out how broad the challenge is in your perspectives. You come from so many different areas, so many different regions, so many different perspectives, either in government or outside government or formally in government.
Petr Kolář, Czech Republic, Initiative for Ukraine Values. What shall we do to persuade Europeans that Ukraine is about us, about our future? We are quite united towards Russia, but we are not united about Ukraine. What shall we do to persuade them?
All right, right to the back, the lady at the back. Who's got the microphone over here, please?
Andreas Umland. I think the Russian regime will, whatever we do, try to subvert the Ukrainian state for years to come, and in particular to poison the business and investment climate in Ukraine and to drive the Ukrainian state into bankruptcy. What can we do against that?
Right, please.
Vlaďka
Right at the back, please.
Vlaďka Votovová, Amol Prague, Czech Republic. What is the future of the Eastern Partnership after the Riga summit?
Remember, we're talking about scenarios rather than questions. Can I just ask you to rephrase that? We're talking about scenarios to deal with Russia at the moment. Scenarios to deal with Russia.
How can we persuade Russia that the Eastern Partnership isn't a tool against them?
Okay, fine. Thank you. Who's got the microphone next? Please.
Rob de Wijk from the Netherlands. What are the geopolitical consequences of Greece leaving the euro and maybe the European Union? Will it turn to Russia? What will it mean for the south flank of NATO?
I think the evidence is there from St. Petersburg overnight that that's where they're moving towards. Please.
Natalia Gumeniuk, Hromadske, Ukraine. And what are the risks of the stalemate? What are the risks, and to whom are these risks if the situation remains like that for a while?
Right, pass the microphone back, and then to then forward. The gentleman with the beard behind, please. Let's not take the long route. Let's take the short route.
Andrea Bogdanovsky, Macedonia. What does it mean for the EU enlargement, Russia's engagement and re-engagement with countries from the Western Balkans on political, economic level, etc.?
Right, I'll take two more, please, here. And there.
Habib Malik from Lebanon. Is there any room left for brutal, honest NATO self-criticism about its role in having brought us to this stage? This has to be a prerequisite for dealing with Russia.
Okay, thank you. Who's got it there? And then the gentleman at the front, please.
Interestingly enough, there hasn't been any question on America. What next can we expect from the United States in coping and handling Russia?
We will, of course, have a lot of views from America this afternoon from Congress. Right, please.
Thank you. Daniel Hegedus, German Council on Foreign Relations. What are the strategic perspectives of the conflict if global energy prices and the Russian incomes parallel to theirs begins to rise again? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I now have a page of things which we've got to address in the next hour and 40 minutes. It shows the variety and the depth of challenges that you all see. So if I can ask our panel to bear some of those in mind, reflect on what we've heard, some on detail, some on principle, some on spirit. And I'm going to come to you in a few minutes after we've heard from Bruce Stokes. Bruce from the Pew Research Center, the floor is yours. With that data that Sandy Veshpal was having to refer to, which he called disconcerting yesterday.
Thank you, Nick, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. And I look forward to your comments and questions, because this survey that we released last week has literally caused quite a stir. And I think Sandy may have even underestimated the kind of concern it's created. So what we are going to do is I'll explain to you a little bit more about the survey, because all the discussion has been about one question. And there's even been some discussion about the wording of the question. But we would also like to, because this is about Russia as well, this discussion, share with you some of the other things that were in the survey, where we actually surveyed Russian public opinion, which will help, I think, frame this discussion. Briefly, what we found was that Americans were willing to come to the defense of a NATO ally. Europeans overwhelmingly expected us to come to the defense of a NATO ally, and there were key NATO allies in Europe who were not willing to go to the defense of other NATO allies. Basically, more than half the Germans, more than half the French, half the Italians, and the Spanish were divided on this issue. But to give you a sense, just to be clear here, the question was, if Russia got into a serious military conflict with one of its neighboring countries that is our NATO ally, do you think our country should use military force to defend that country? That's about as close to the Article 5 language as we could get. And so I do think we need to ponder why it is that our publics are reluctant. Now, the reality is it varies greatly between countries. And in part, it's driven by who sees Russia as a military threat. Only 36% of the Germans see the Russians as a military threat. Now, 70% of the Poles see Russia as a military threat. So threat perception here drives a lot of this attitude. But there are other things behind this that I think we need to ponder. One is that German opinion, which is probably the least reluctant to do anything, the least worried, is deeply divided along East-West lines. A generation after reunification, the East is more inclined not to see this as a threat, more pro-Putin, more easy on Russia than the West. So there are two Germanys here. I would also point out to you there are two Americas. You will hear this afternoon, if I'm not mistaken, from 3 Republican senators. Take what they say with a grain of salt, because they represent people, they were elected by people who are actually the toughest on this issue. 56% of Americans say they will come to the aid of a NATO ally if attacked by Russia, but it's 69% of Republicans and only 47% of Democrats. So it's not as if America is necessarily united on this issue either. So we have a lot to talk about among ourselves about what this all means. Beyond the NATO question, we did ask people, what do you want to do about Ukraine? Overwhelmingly, people are willing to give Ukraine more economic aid. A median of 70% say they're willing to give Ukraine more economic aid. 57% of publics would give a NATO membership to Ukraine, but there are real differences there. 62% of Americans say they would do that, but only 36% of Germans. So there's a difference in perception of what NATO membership means within the NATO alliance. Half the Europeans would give EU membership to Ukraine. But again, only 41% of the Germans would do that. So again, we have a lot of discussion about what it is we're willing to do or not do. On the economic sanction issue on Russia, the plurality response is we'd like to keep them where the sanctions are, and that's probably where we've ended up. So there's support for that. But bear in mind that 29% of the Germans and 25% of the French said we actually want to decrease the sanctions. So there are minorities in those two countries, not insignificant minorities, who would prefer to actually decrease the sanctions. So this issue is not totally resolved in our countries. If we can now turn to the slides on public opinion in Russia. And you can just go through. If you want to know about the Pew Research Center or the methodology, we can talk about that later. But it's basically 1,000 people in Russia, face-to-face interviews. It reflects the entire country. Keep going. There. First conclusion and first takeaway. The Russian intervention in Ukraine has been very, very good for Vladimir Putin. We have asked in Russia for a number of years, do you have confidence in Vladimir Putin? As you can see, it's been on the rise for a number of years now. We've asked people, people in Russia, do you have a favorable view of your own country? And that is also on the rise. And bear in mind, these are a lot of confidence and very favorable. People are given 4 options: a lot of confidence, somewhat confidence, very little confidence, no confidence at all. This is intense public support for Putin and intense and rising nationalism. We ask people, this is the Minsk question, we ask people in Ukraine and in Russia, what do you want the Donbass, how do you want this to be resolved? Half of Ukrainians say we want the Donbass to return to Ukraine status quo ante. Not a federation, we want them to be just part of Ukraine again as they were before. Half of the Russians say we want Ukraine to be independent or part of Russia. So there is a real difference in public opinion between Ukrainians and Russians as to what they would like to see the ultimate outcome to be. Favorability of Putin is on the decline in the West. Favorability of Russia is in the decline in the West. This is probably not surprising. I would point out to you, though, that in confidence in Putin, 23% of Germans have confidence in Putin. And the 16 is the median of all 8 NATO countries that we surveyed. Also, 21% of Americans have confidence in Putin. I'm not quite sure I know who those people are, but I did have somebody in Germany tell me 2 days ago, I visit the South a lot, they live in the South. But I can't prove that, but it's an interesting thing. So this is Russian public opinion. Let me address one question. People constantly say to us, can you really believe Russians when you ask them in a public opinion survey what they believe? Are they really just telling you a politically correct answer? Now, I'll leave that up to you. I can tell you that our survey results broadly reflect the survey results of Levada and other people who have done surveys in Russia, so we think there's a consistency there. But more importantly, you now have 73% of the Russians say that the economy is doing poorly. That's up 23 percentage points in 1 year. That's not a very politically correct answer, I can imagine. And so if people are reluctant to be truthful, they're highly selective about whether truthful, because this would appear to be something they believe in. We asked people about the Western sanctions and Russians and what they thought about them. 45% think they're having a major effect on the economy. But when you ask them why is the economy doing so poorly, a third say it's sanctions, a third say it's the oil prices, and only a quarter blame the government, which suggests to me, at least, that the government has been very successful in convincing the public that it's not our fault. The West is doing this to us in some way or other. This, to my mind, is a very interesting result. Just a year ago, a plurality of Russians believed that what had happened in Ukraine was good for Russia's image abroad. It was a positive, it made people feel more favorable towards Russia. This year, a plurality say, actually, it's hurt our image. Now, let me tell you, as an American, it took about 4 or 5 years for Americans to realize that the invasion of Iraq had hurt our image abroad. The Russians seem to have gotten this message in 1 year. We asked about how Putin was doing. How was he handling various things, and do you think he's doing a good job or a bad job? Overwhelmingly, people think he's doing a good job. Handling foreign policy, handling the EU, handling energy policy, handling the economy, even handling corruption, they think he's doing a good job. No comment. What this has not done for the West is improve our reputation in Russia. And I would say to my German friends, you may see yourselves as the arbiter between the West and Russia, but you're not getting any credit from it from the Russian people. Notice that several years ago, 78% of Russians had a favorable view of Germany. Now only 35% do. Now, frankly, only 15% have a favorable view of the United States. That's approaching the attitudes towards the U.S. in Muslim countries during the Iraq War. So they really don't like us. Also, half of Russians believe that NATO poses a military threat to Russia. So again, this does feed into a narrative that has developed in Russia. We had a breakfast this morning. We talked about Ukraine over that breakfast. A lot of support from a lot of the Ukrainians there about still having a prospect to join the EU and join NATO. The Russians are overwhelmingly opposed to that for Ukraine. But the interesting result is the Eurasian Economic Union, this Russian-created entity, Russian publics aren't so sure they want Ukraine in that. And you can see it in our data that Russians don't really like Ukraine that much. They may covet parts of it, but they don't necessarily want to be that close to Ukraine. We ask periodically, are there parts of other countries that really belong to your country? We ask this not only in Russia, we ask it all over the world. 61% of Russians believe that there are parts of other countries that really belong to Russia, and this has been consistent for over a decade. I might point out to you that when we asked this question in Hungary in 2009, 61% of Hungarians said that there was some part of other country that belonged to them. So revanchism is not only a Russian preserve. By the way, 69% of Russians believe that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a mistake. So there's an overwhelming nostalgia. That's a brief overview of the results. I hope this will help inform the discussion. Thank you.
Bruce, thank you very much indeed. We could have everyone on the panel, so you can be on the panel as well, but you can intervene from there. Let me give you one other data point. Yesterday afternoon, we actually did a debate in the City Talks, and there were 250 people there, not from this population necessarily. Some were, but not from this population necessarily. And the debate it was a kind of Oxford-style debate, 2 for the motion, 2 against. NATO and EU member states in Western Europe must assume Russia will work to subvert them, including using military force. And we had 2 Russian representatives against that. I should tell you that when everyone arrived, the vote was 64% for the motion and 36% against. But the debate shifted it markedly towards support for the motion. 3/4 of those in the room took the view that the motion was correct about the danger of subversion and the bleak prospects ahead. So I ask you to think of that, because when I quoted that first question from Hussein Bastami from the BBC World Service, if tomorrow Russian troops move towards Kiev, do you believe NATO will or can declare war on Moscow? We are, panel, thinking about scenarios and strategies. And this came up explicitly yesterday with the 250 in the City Talk. How bleak dare we really be at this moment when it comes to planning and thinking of the options? Foreign Minister.
First, I'd like to react to what we're talking about and with whom we are dealing, with whom we have business. And frankly, when the title, you didn't mention title, it's about beer, which evokes, and I disagree. It's not a beer anymore, first of all. It should be some different animal, maybe guinea pig, for instance, because it's not from Guinea and not a pig.
But guinea pigs have far smaller teeth.
No, my point is that they are living in parallel reality. They are cheating their own people, they are littering minds of other people, and they are paying big money for propaganda, which is also partially explains all these surveys and attitudes. And big money, 600 million euros last year, 600 million next year for all these media outlets, including Russia Yesterday and others. So this is really something we should take into account very seriously, at least not to underestimate, and this is the picture. And then we can talk about other things, what we should do. You told about these troops to Kiev, and there were questions also about red lines. I would ask you, how many times these red lines were crossed by tanks, if we're talking about Ukraine? How more times needed to do the same? That's also the same question. Is it not enough? Okay, let's try. So this is exactly something what we should think about our own thinking, frankly. And it's not about Ukraine, it's about us, about our perception, about our ability to react on time, not too late, to do sufficient things, not partial. And then we are seeking the results. And again, one more point, which is coming after what we just discussed. There are lessons which were not learned by us many times. And let me remind, let's not go far away in the history. Let's remind 2008, occupation of part of Georgia. And then we said, look, it will be the same story if we'll react in the same way, if we'll get back to business as usual, if we'll be not consistent in our approach and our policy, which was the case. And as you remember, in 2 months, we got back to business as usual. So we got Crimea, and now we have creeping annexation of South Ossetia.
But I must press you, because this is going to underpin the discussion for the next 90 minutes. How bleak do the assumptions now have to be in terms of preparation?
We have to do our job. We shouldn't be involved in the propaganda games run by them. We have to do what we have to do in guaranteeing security of our people. According to Washington Treaty, guarantee security of our populations, citizens, territories, and not over-dramatizing that, and not trying to play the same propaganda game with them.
Just to be clear, you think, Foreign Minister, there's a danger of over-dramatization?
It's always danger to move to some edges, you know, on one side to be relaxed, that we are just secure and we have guarantees, on the other side to over-dramatize. So I would choose the middle approach, which means not sleeping, but doing our business, doing business as usual.
All right, Carl Bildt, you're maybe fortunate enough no longer to be Foreign Minister to have to comment in public about this. Your analysis now, given, as Ed reminded us, you had a Good Friday scare in Sweden when suddenly the Russians decided to test your defenses. Now, that wasn't something you were expecting.
Well, I think that's been misinterpreted to a certain extent. They didn't test our defenses. They were flying over the Baltic. They're perfectly entitled to do that. It's international airspace. But what we do see them doing is, of course, that they are more than rebuilding their military. And what we see them doing, they were out flying the other day again with Tu-22s. They are flexing their muscles all the time. And we are reacting without overreacting to that, being aware of the dangers that
So that question, how pessimistic must you now be?
Well, I think it's dependent upon us. I think if we have the patience and we have the resolve and we have the unity, I wouldn't be overly pessimistic. We are big and strong. Russia is not as strong as it wants to be seen as. If we get fragmented, and if we lose the patience and we lose the resolve, then Russia might move, and probably will move. I think Putin is, from that point of view, he's more opportunistic than strategic. I think the most interesting, if you want to read a speech by Putin that is truly revealing, read the March 18 speech, the Crimea speech. Because what it was saying that was essentially, yeah, we had this Ukraine, we recognized it, it was okay and fine, and suddenly there was an opportunity. I knew in my heart that Crimea was Russian. And when the opportunity was there, he jumped at it. So then it's a question for us to make certain that those opportunities are not there by showing the unity and the resolve and blocking the possibility for him to use military force. But if we fail, he will move.
Right, let's be clear before we go to a Russian view. How decisive and how clear do you think we are, the West is at the moment? After all, Swedish troops have been involved in the Baltops exercise currently going on. When it comes to the resolution and the resilience and the determination, what has to be shown which sends that message to Russia? Foreign Minister.
Well, I think so far, I mean, I don't think necessarily that sanctions are going to sort out this particular issue, but I think sanctions has become a symbol for us staying together. So far, so good, as a matter of fact. Whether that will be continued remains to be seen. Support for Ukraine, we could do more, we should do more, but we are doing a fair amount. It's going to be dependent upon the Ukrainians. I think from the Moscow perspective, they've been surprised by the fact that we've been sticking together as far as we have.
But again, what signals have to be sent, given that the Gerasimov military doctrine is very clear?
Yeah.
First use of nuclear weapons if necessary.
Yeah,
what has to be done in terms of the decisions from, say, inside NATO?
Well, inside, I'm outside NATO. But anyhow,
but that's
why you asked so much.
That's why I said at the beginning you're no longer foreign minister.
Absolutely.
Therefore, you can comment.
I can say whatever
what
I want.
should be done?
I think what you see, you have a line throughout Europe, everything throughout the West, everything east of that is now raising defense expenditure. Defense expenditure are going up in Europe, nearly all over the place. We have different readiness things that are being done. The exercises might be smaller than what the Russians do. I think that's wise, by the way, because they're spending far too much money on essentially rather useless exercises. We are doing somewhat more sophisticated exercises. These things are happening. And then the sanctions issue, as I said, not the sanctions in themselves, but the fact that these decisions are showing resolve. So continue along this particular path, be more clear on supporting Ukraine as long as Ukraine is supporting itself, which I think Ukraine will do. And that means that blocking the options and the opportunities of Putin to move. But what we have learned, and we should have seen that lesson more clearly in 2008, with the Georgia war, that he is prepared to use even military force in critical situation if the opportunity arises. And our task is to make certain that the opportunity does not arise. That is a task that we are perfectly capable of doing if the political will is sufficient.
Thank you. Minister, and then I'm going to come to you, Sergei. And do please use the app, because if there are ideas which are coming to you and you're listening to this discussion, it's a great way of getting those ideas to me now rather than me coming to you in half an hour. Please, Foreign Minister.
Just to say that I believe we have to realize that only tangible arguments can make a difference here. We are very creative, capable in nice statements and right statements, but they do not have any impression. And one more point, what has to do with these scenarios, as we are discussing, I would suggest one radical and fundamental change in the approach. If you, I may use this term reset, if it's not very popular now in our thinking, and to realize that if we are doing something right, it cannot be provocative. There's a view that let's not do something, let's not state too sharp, it will be provocative. Let's not name names, it's provocative. No, I would say it's provocative if you are not doing in time right things. If you're doing not sufficient, if you're doing too late, it's a signal to act. And coming back to my first point, only tangible arguments can work. So why we have to, answering to your question, to implement what was decided in Wales, in NATO summit, to have more NATO physically footprint on the territories of East and Central Europe, including Baltic states, what's now taking place. And these are arguments which can maybe make impression, will not change mind of their or thinking, but at least it will be sufficient in order to mitigate what's happening now.
Right. Sergei, thanks for your patience, but you've heard the data coming from Bruce. You've heard the kind of arguments. You've heard about 20 interventions of concern. What's your view from Moscow about what signal is being sent? Is it defiant, resilient, and robust enough, or is it being seen as weak?
Being in Mr. Putin's shoes, not in my own, I received a very clear signal that I was completely right 1 year ago, year and a half, when I grabbed Crimea and started military operation in Ukraine, because I was completely sure NATO will not go to defend Ukraine. That's what means my strategic analysis, I don't know, strategic, tactic, it doesn't matter. My analysis was correct, that no one is going to protect Ukraine. And no one is going to resist me. That's the first and the most important point. And that is the underlying pillar for Mr. Putin's actions 1 year ago.
And let me just press you on that then. What do you think his view is now? We heard from Sandy Vershbow yesterday very clearly, there are regular Russian units operating now in eastern Ukraine. It is de facto a war which Russia is engaged in outside its national territory.
Yes, correct. Next point from Moscow views. Not only Western opinion has changed, Russian public opinion has changed dramatically. There recently was a poll results of some Russian organizations demonstrating that in August last year, 68% of Russians supported Donbass to become a part of Russia. Nowadays, only 19%. So Novorossiya as a project, as a political project, to absorb a part of Ukraine is not on the agenda, is not on the table for Putin today. It will not be supported by Russian public opinion, as well as Russians, they do not support official war in Ukraine. Russians don't want Russia to be in a war with Ukraine, and that's why I believe that Putin rejects any talks about Russian troops in Ukraine. And that's why, coming to our debate at the moment, I believe there should not be any fear on NATO countries of Russian actions. Putin seems impressed by Western actions, by United States actions to deploy troops, to deploy tanks in NATO countries, and he is not ready to go for a war. He is ready to chase NATO. He is ready to make you nervous. He's going to make you react, maybe to make some mistakes, but he is not ready to go for a war. So his target is not NATO countries. With all respect to Baltic countries, you are not a target. His target still is Ukraine, maybe a part of it somewhere in the future, and I suppose Belarus as well. Let's imagine some years later, Mr. Lukashenko either loses elections or passes away, something happens.
But what about the argument that there is clear evidence of subversive activities by the Russian agencies in almost every EU country and every NATO nation and beyond, including on Iceland, where they've deployed vast numbers of extra diplomats? And we heard from President Ilves the fears ongoing there. We heard it at Lennart Meri a few weeks ago as well. These are deep fears, even if you make that kind of reassurance.
Okay, Mr. Putin believes that he is in war with the West. Not he is fighting West, not this war, but the West is fighting Russia. West wants to humiliate Russia by military and foreign policy actions. And he is reacting. So I would not be surprised, for example, if the United States intelligence in Russia is more active today rather than 2 years ago.
Well, we know it is. It's a fact of life.
Yes, we don't know. Maybe it's more active, maybe it's less active. But I would not be surprised if it is more active. Yeah, and that's why Putin you believe that for him, military exercises of Russian by 70,000 military troops is an expensive experiment? No, it's not. Russian military budget is growing enormously. There are enormous funds dedicated not only for procurements, but for current support of military troops. So it doesn't matter to have a military exercise somewhere in the Far East and to deteriorate relations with China, or to run them near the Baltic countries' border and to make all Europe nervous, to make all NATO nervous, understanding that there is no any consequences. Russian pilots, Russian fighters, bombers They fly very close to international borders, but they do not cross them.
But I'm talking about subversion, political subversion, use, as we've been hearing. We don't need to repeat all these arguments.
Sure.
The evidence has been put forward here in the last 20 hours. Very clear evidence of very active measures by various Russian interests against the political class, not just Marine Le Pen, but there's other evidence, some of it unsubstantiated at the moment, designed to exploit and create a degree of political instability. Now, you're nodding, Carl Bildt, because you've just come from Denmark, where there's been an interesting shift in power, and you're seeing it in Sweden as well. What do you detect? What do you detect of the other dangers which can't be necessarily reacted to in a kinetic way via NATO, but have to be reacted to in other ways, as we heard the President say this morning?
Because they are more of a political nature. But let me first comment just on sort of from the Putin point of view, where was he successful and not. I agree that he was very successful with Crimea. And I think that is the very basis of the result that we see in the opinion polls, because he has very strong popular support. He was nervous during the Crimea operation. He didn't fear that NATO was going to defend Crimea. That was never going to happen. But he feared that the Ukrainians were going to defeat Crimea. And under normal circumstances, that might well have happened. But it was obviously days of disarray in Kiev. And the Ukrainian forces that were quite not insubstantial in Crimea couldn't do anything. Then he became too agitated from that, I think, and went on and expected Novorossiya to be established fairly, nearly as easily within 2 or 3 months. And he was surprised by the fact that actually Ukraine defended itself, and defended itself to the extent that in August the entire thing was about to collapse. And he had to engage rather substantial units of the regular Russian forces to prevent the complete collapse of these so-called People's Republic. And since then, in a slightly different mood of probing, disturbing, small attacks, waiting for our patience to wear thin. But I think it's important for our analysis that we have a proper view of what I think my view is, that is what's happening. Back to your question.
The domestic issues.
The domestic issues that we face in X numbers of European countries. I think the Russians are as active as they can be in order to support things that are happening anyhow. I think even if we have a high confidence in the ability of the Russian propaganda, I'm not quite so certain that they can create something that doesn't exist. So they can play on existing fears and existing divisions, and we should have no illusions whatsoever on their intention to do so. We have a very sort of critical moment, or a very difficult moment, when I see Denmark, for example, I mean, very much anti-immigration, and the anti-immigration is very much an anti-EU, because they say that EU has opened the borders and strange people are coming in, and we don't like that, and then we vote for these particular parties. And of course, Putin stands for a policy that is against opening borders, and for muscular nationalism direct against foreigners. And that means that there's a connect between sort of the populist, nationalist, anti-EU inside our countries and the basic message of Putin. And then he plays on sort of, he's not only revisionist, he's also reactionary in terms of values. I mean, 2 secular societies, 2 liberal societies. It is the muscular East versus the decadent West. We've got the guns and you got the gays. And there are, as has been demonstrated, I mean, the segment of our public opinions that are receptive to that. And that means that the values battles and the battles for sort of the basic ideas of European integration and working together is fundamentally important also in the context of us being able to deny the options of him on standing up to
because the challenge has been laid
there.
down again by the President and others this morning, President Ilves as well. This is a challenge now for the politicians, and you're representing it, Foreign Minister, here. You're retired for a bit, well, for a moment anyway.
For the time being, yeah.
For the time being, we don't know what his plans are, but we don't know what his scenarios are.
Never knows when I will retire.
Foreign Minister, how do you feel as a politician? You know, you can talk about deployment of troops and 2% and so on, but there's the other issue of minds, and that's very clear, whether it be disinformation, misinformation, miskirovka, whatever. What is your view as a politician about how the political class have got to understand and rise to this challenge?
I know effect of that. I know, since I can speak Russian, I can watch Russian state-controlled TV. I know what these programs mean. I have many friends who say that they are far from politics, But de facto, they are already ready, so to say, to be manipulated because of this flood of lies, you know. And we are underestimating that fact. So we are not taking this seriously. And not talking about censorship, no, by far. I'm talking about facilitation of alternative sources of information, especially Russian-speaking channels. People are simply cheated, you know, very simple. And the effect is huge. And I always telling the story, what I like very much, that story we mentioned Crimea, when our ambassador was talking to locals in Crimea during the so-called referendum, and elderly people from Russia, they were scared that bandits and fascists, I'm quoting, coming from Kiev, to kill them. They are convinced it's happening. They were happy to see Russian soldiers. They welcomed because they saved them. So we're talking about things like that. So littering of oceans is a big problem for world summits and littering of minds not addressed properly at all. We have to take it very seriously. And this is the factor which reflects everything what we were talking here, even survey. I know there's probably right what you presented, but I cannot imagine if you ask somebody in the street in Moscow, do you support Putin's policy? And he will say, no, I'm sorry, I doubt, yeah? I don't imagine that. Maybe there are some methods how to make it. So this is something we should take into account very seriously. And frankly, we have to do more in order to diminish or bridge the gap between us and citizens, and has to do not only with NATO, but also with European Union, if I may. And by the way, Prime Minister Cameron is right when he's saying gap between citizens and institutions. Let's address together. This is something we cannot be efficient in our policies, since you're asking me as a politician, so I can say we are guilty, we are responsible. It's not people who are guilty. They really cannot be guilty simply because we are not efficient enough. We are underestimating very essential points.
All right. Now, many of you may be reassured by all of this. You may be frustrated. You may think we're not going far enough. Bruce, have you got your microphone on still?
No, I think it is. Just to address this point about the influence of Russian propaganda in the West, we did ask a question about who people in NATO countries blamed for the violence in Ukraine. And I must admit, and I must acknowledge, when my colleagues asked this, I tried to argue against it. I said, well, this is crazy. Everybody knows it was Russia. Why we're wasting a question on something we don't know the answer of. What was interesting is that people tended to blame Russia, but we gave them other options. And what was interesting was the percentage of people in some countries who actually blamed the Ukrainians. Either they blamed Russian-speaking Ukrainians or the Ukrainian government. 44% of the French blamed somebody in Ukraine, not Russia. 34% of the Germans blamed somebody in Ukraine, not Russia. And 12% of the Germans blamed the West. So I do think that there's some evidence that this is having an impact.
All right, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Nick and Simon, can I just put up my scratch pad here of the kind of things that were raised from my iPad here. I've just tried to capture some of the things that all of you were saying right at the beginning. It's very incomplete. It's not exclusive, but this is the kind of area. Maybe you can respond to some of these before I open it up again. The issue of the Asia focus, the concern there about Asia issues. Also, the issues connected to a Russia-Putin collapse. Now, I say that because, and maybe I can beef that up, I don't know if there is anyone from Chatham House here, but Chatham House produced a devastating document 2 weeks ago, saying if you think it's bad now, if there's a collapse of the Putin regime with everyone scrabbling for their positions and defend their positions, it's going to be much worse. But I leave you to comment on that. I don't have it in my pocket at the moment. The issue of Ukraine, there being a non-military solution and the need for Ukraine to defend itself. The role of Turkey-Russia relations, and the attitude of the next generation, and we've got many of them represented here within the GLOBSEC community. You've talked about sanctions, but this issue of resilience of NATO and the European Union and the degree for self-criticism, and are NATO and the EU becoming bogged down by these kind of issues? Very incomplete, but is there anything you'd like to address from that kind of pull together and trying to bring together some of the issues which have been raised in the 20 or so interventions? Carl?
Well, I very much recommend the report that was put out by Chatham House, which you made an ad for. I mean, it is one of the best documents we produced in Europe in the last few months or last year on that particular subject. But I'm not quite so convinced of this argument that you hear around that everything is worse than Putin. Because at some point in time, what is going to happen in Russia is that they will wake up to the fact that they failed in the modernization of their country, which is essential. And it is not oil prices and it is not sanctions Russia was entering a structural crisis well before that. Read the book of Yegor Gaidar on Russia, The Long View, which came out with his analysis well before both oil and sanctions, and he sort of goes through the failure to modernize. At some point in time, this is going to hit Russia. Russia is not composed solely of unintelligent, stupid people. There are sort of 140 million Russians. Out of these, there's an educated elite. And we should not give up the hope that at some point in time, when they see the writing of the wall for their country, that they will also go for a modernization policy that is genuine. And there is no European country that can modernize in isolation from other European countries. Or you could say, no country anywhere in the world that can modernize without integration with the rest of the world. You can't do it in isolation. Russia can't do it in isolation. China can't do it in isolation. The only place that has tried in North Korea, and it's not a smashing success. So, I mean, we should be aware of the risks that things might get worse if Putin leaves. But I wouldn't assume that that is a given.
Sergei,
There's
what's
also
your
the
view?
other possibility.
Carl, unfortunately, I have to disagree with you.
Yeah, that's good. We
And
must do
yes, and I would say it's wishful thinking, long-term wishful thinking. Yes, if we look for 100 years in front, definitely Russia will recognize sooner or later that no modernization is not a good scenario. But I hope Putin will not survive for 100 years. So we can understand. We have to recognize that what political regime we see in Russia is an absolute monarchy, and no one can win elections and take power except of Putin. So until now, we know that he will be re-elected, renominated in 2018 until 2024. No one knows what happens further on. And do you believe that in 10 years, the lack of modernization will influence Russian public opinion? No, there is no public opinion. 85% of Russian people receive information from TV, and TV is controlled by the government.
But it is a legitimate scoping question. What happens after Putin? He's 62.
He will be 72, yes.
Mugabe is 92,
yes, so.
And still there. Kagame wants to stay on as well. But these are legitimate questions in this digital age about how any country copes with a change of leadership.
One way or another. One way or another country will cope. Unfortunately, and that's my point of disagreement with Carl, that I believe that in the recent 100 years, Russia has two experiences of the political regime collapsed because of lack of institutions. Once it happens in 1917, when Nikolai II, the last Russian emperor, resigned, and all Russian institutions were it was a vertical of power based on emperor, and all institutions collapsed. And despite political democracy in February, March 1917 was much more developed than today in Russia, all political parties, Duma, and business and big business, of course there was a war, but they were unable to create new public institutions to keep the power. And several months later, the gang came to power and transformed the country. Country lost a huge part of its territory. Luckily, we have experience of Finland that may successful, but we have experience of Central Asia.
Foreign Minister.
And the next time it happened in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. In the Soviet Union, there was the same vertical of power based on Communist Party. Communist Party disappeared, all institutions disappeared, country collapsed. So when Putin will leave, will pass away, all institutions are based on him. And that is the scenario. That is if he survives until 2036, that's the most evident scenario. Russia should collapse because no institutions at all.
All right, I'll invite others to comment on this as well. But what do you think, if there were to be this collapse, Foreign Minister? Is that a planning assumption that has to be made now, with everything else going on?
Everything should be made, but being in active position in the government, I will not speculate about change of power in another country. What I would like to say, we shouldn't demonize.
Well, we're not speculating about change of power. We're talking about realpolitik in any country.
I'm coming to the point that we have not to demonize whole Russia because it's different. We have to have outreach to the people, intellectuals. We have to talk to them. What we are doing, by the way, in Lithuania. And also, we should conduct a decent dialogue with Russia itself, what we are not doing always. I have in mind that our agenda usually reactive, our policy very often defensive, and our position in negotiations as a demandeurs. They are never demanding nothing, never ever. We always demanding. And that's the point. Also, when we are constructing our relations, we are saying that this should be based on values, principles, but it's not anymore, and always on this interests coming over. National policies also coming over at the expense of unity of Europe. And this is, again, we have to take it very seriously. So again, among the recipes or scenarios for the future, what we have to do at least, to be united with regard to the pressure, not too many options in our possession sanctions, and also we have to perform the so-called political isolation, I would say, which we are not doing at all. And I'm not saying that should cut all relations, of course not, but we have to avoid all these public summits without no outcome and with the impression that we have business as usual, which is sold immediately in Russia for Russian public, that it's everything is fine and everything is according the plans as it was so far. So these are conditions, fundamental conditions, which are not fulfilled by us so far. So let's not go so too far about these calculations and contingency plannings. What is important, and we have to calculate, but let's do at least what we have to do, what we are not doing.
Carl Bildt, do you accept that if Putin were to go, I mean, just building on the Chatham House analysis, that there would be a stability of all organizational structures, and that we can assume it would be, quote, business as usual? Chatham House is being far bleaker than that.
Well, I mean, everything depends on the scenarios. A collapse of February 1917 or sort of also 1991, yeah, absolutely. Then we have a complete collapse, and then you don't know what's going to happen. But I wouldn't say that 1991, yes, structures, the Communist Party disintegrated, but the country didn't do that badly after all.
It lost 14 provinces out of 15.
Well, yes, but still, if we take Russia during the 1990s, it was a very difficult period, needless to say, but I do think it made some advances that were, it was by no means certain that it was going to go sort of the Putin road. Some people believe that was unavoidable, given the patterns of European history. I'm not quite certain of that, but it did happen. 1917 was, of course, a completely different matter, that was a complete collapse. Were we to be in such a situation, then I say all bets are off. But there could also be, at some point in time, a somewhat more orderly transition. That is a very difficult one, because the longer people stay in power, the more they are impressed with themselves, and the more reluctant they are to hand over power. You never know.
But we're talking about strategies and scenarios here. And
there could even be coups.
We understand what the foreign minister was saying, but you're not in government anymore. If you were still in the European Council...
I wouldn't say anything then.
I know. That's why I'm asking you now. Would you be pressing for position papers to be being drawn up for these bleak worst-case scenarios and strategies?
No, I wouldn't, because I don't think the European Union has sufficient resources to do such papers. But I would.
Is anyone here from the External Action Service who'd like to talk about that?
But as a matter of fact, but I would be more relying on issues or sort of gatherings like this.
Okay.
Think tanks, academics, independents to do things.
Right.
And one thing where I think is going to be important for the future of Russia, Linas was alluding to some extent. What is happening also with the tragedy of internal developments in Russia is that we have a significant brain drain. People that are leaving Russia. I mean, we focus quite a lot on those that are leaving Russia because of money and go to London, but there's quite a number of them that are leaving, middle-class people, journalists, intellectuals, and whatever, for completely other reasons. And they end up in Riga, in Vilnius, in Berlin, and other places.
Sometimes involuntarily as well.
Sometimes involuntarily. We need to engage with them to listen to their thinking about the future of Russia, because they know Russia better than most of us, and they also have credibility, and they might be an asset for the future of the country.
Is there anyone like that here, actually, who's...
Well, there's one there.
Please, yes.
Thank you. I'm Alain Delettre from Frida in Brussels.
No, hang on. I asked a question about from a Russian, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah. Just relating to what Carl has just said.
I'm sorry, since I am from Russia, it's
Don't
not a
apologize for being
question.
from Russia.
Yes, it's one very small commentary to my good friend, Mr. Aleksashenko. I am absolutely disagreed with his historical analogies. I think that Russia was not collapsed in 1917 in one moment after resignation of emperor, and Russia for sure was not collapsed in 1991. After the resignation of emperor for five years, it was a civil war in Russia. So it was a terrible struggle between forces for Russia and for communism.
Well, can you look forward to now what
Yes,
might happen?
I think that now, Mr. Putin is not a person without whom Russia failed to be. And maybe if he resigns in a month, and we can organize something in Russian political circles, it will be much better for Russia and for Europe in the idea of stability than if he will reign up till 2066, yes. I think that these historical parallels are not right. I'm a historian.
All right, well,
myself.
let me just ask you this question, your view, and there may be one or two others as well. Do you believe that were there to be a change for whatever reason in the Kremlin, that Russia would remain stable and resilient and the organs of power would remain largely intact?
I suppose it depends on many items, but the main one is the peaceful shift of power without revolution. I am sure that I live in Russia, not outside Russia, and I can feel it myself each moment. I see that our elite is disintegrated now, and we call it the struggle of Kremlin towers between each other. And so if it will be possible, it is possible to organize this shift of power without social revolt, it will be wonderful possibility for stability.
Thank you. I want to hear from any other Russian voices who feel they're not being heard at the moment.
Russian voice, yes.
Yeah, and also further back as well to Elena. Can we go to Elena first, please?
Who's first?
Further back, please. And you better introduce why you're answering this.
Hello, I'm Yelena Korostylova, and I'm not Russian but Belarusian, but with mixed roots. And just wanted to comment, actually.
Yeah, but you can see the question.
Yes,
and
the
I want
question,
that,
yes, and
yeah, I want
we've
that
conducted
addressed.
also surveys in Russia and Belarus and Eastern Partnership region altogether. So we keep forgetting that Russia is a totally different beast, be it a guinea pig or a bear or whatever it is. It is not only different in terms of actions, it is different in terms of its values. And at the heart of the Russian system, actually, values like order, hierarchy, one-man rule. So whatever, if Putin is were to be removed from power, there will be still an aspiration to retain the system as it is. And therefore, there might be a worse scenario. We might have Ivan the Terrible. Putin is not really, the worst, perhaps, of the evils that Russia has come to endure. So therefore, until the values, the normative underpinning of the systems are changed, only then we can actually contemplate Russia as a different place.
We were having this discussion last night on the bus, but you're a professor of international relations. Do the next generation that you are teaching understand that in Britain?
Well, we have a discussion, and I think hopefully that discussion will enlighten and will start developing an understanding that we should not just concentrate on ourselves, we should also try and understand the other. That's why we removed geopolitics from the agenda, strangely enough, especially from the EU point of view. But geopolitics precisely presumes and points that there are different worlds, there are different others, and we need to understand how they work and what is at the heart of their system. And there is hope, yes.
Pass the microphone forward to the other Russian voice, please.
Andrei Leonov, Kate Institute, but Russian, yes. I think it's a very important point to keep in mind that in 1917, in 1991, and right now, Russia was authoritarian system and multi-ethnic empire. So that is why collapse of this country led not only some kind of loss of 14 provinces. These 14 provinces were 14 nations in 91, and in 1917 it was 5 new independent nations that have been created as a result of this collapse of the country. Now, with the inevitable collapse of the authoritarian system in multi-ethnic empire, the process of dissolution of this multi-ethnic empire is not finished yet, would lead to creation a number of new independent nations, definitely in northern Caucasus, like Chechnya, Dagestan, Kabarda, Tataria, Bashkortostan, Yakutia, Tuva, and so on. It is, first of all, unavoidable. More or less, it is desirable, because the democratic, free, and peaceful Russia might be created only with different borders.
So, what's your thought about how those who are non-Russian should understand what you say is going to happen, and therefore what the scenarios should be?
Like Estonians or Poles or Finns today, so they just will be looking for tomorrow for the possibility of creating of new independent nations.
All right, fine. Let me move on. I've got some points here. Let me, if I may, Simon, let's go to some of these questions. There's a point here from Karl-Georg Wellman, who's a member of the German Parliament. First of all, number 5 here. I'd like to put the polls in Germany in the right light. 82% believe that Putin cannot be trusted in Germany. Almost the same number believe that Russia is responsible for the conflict in Ukraine, and 83% think that Russia does not respect human rights. So that's a data point there, and Ed Lucas has made the point about the Pew questions, and maybe, Bruce, if you just want to clarify this, the Pew question did not ask Germans if they're willing to defend NATO allies if attacked, only asked what they would do in the event that allies got into a conflict. Is that correct?
No. That's correct, because we wanted to be have it be a broader question that at least gave some sense that the next Article 5 situation may not be tanks rolling across the border, which is what Article 5 was probably written for. And I think that's one of the things I would be curious to get our panelists' reaction to is Article 5 not appropriate for the situation that's most likely to happen based on the Ukraine experience? That we would have a situation where men in green jackets who speak Russian and claim to be Estonian nationals, and they're rebelling finally against the oppression of Tallinn, and there's at least a confused propagandistic message about what's going on, against a backdrop in a number of our countries where at least a significant minority of the population don't want to do anything anyway. And how we avoid, Article 5 was designed, it seems to me, for an elite decision made overnight of overt aggression. But how do you handle these kinds of situations?
All right, well, Bruce, let's nail this now, given that it's underpinning so much of what we're talking about. We know the theory, we know the deployment that's just gone on, we know that Boltops is happening. We'll come to the panel in a moment. President Ilves, Article 5, let's keep the debate just on Article 5 when it comes to scenarios and strategies.
Let me just say, the old expression about generals fighting the last war, I mean, we are generalizing from what happened in Ukraine to everyone else. When in fact, I mean, if you look at the behavior, I mean, the kinds of snap exercises done on our borders, then we don't think at all about little green men. We think about big green Spetsnaz landing, doing a genuine invasion.
When does the red line get crossed for Estonia?
As soon as they cross the border.
Okay, so they've got to physically cross the border.
Well, they've done that.
Exactly.
They've actually abducted someone from Estonian territory, which goes back to the Stalin era, actually. But my point is that we are too hung up on a scenario that worked in Ukraine, but I do not think it would work in my country. And here again, they say, oh, you have Russians in Ukraine, you have Russians in Estonia. The difference is a Donbass Russian miner gets 150 euros a month. An Estonian Russian miner gets 1,500 to 2,500 euros a month. You know, the people in Narva, everyone says, is Narva next? Well, in fact, they're the people who know the best what Russia's like, and they go over there to buy cheap alcohol and cheap cigarettes. And if you ask them, do you want to be there? They go, never, never. They like being in a European Union country with being able to work anywhere. So in our analysis, we're not facing a little green man scenario at all. And if you look at the pattern of military exercises, then we're looking at precisely an Article 5 operation. Our concern is how quickly they can come in, rather than the traditional NATO era build up of troops behind your border. They can do like that.
Are you comfortable that the military committee and those around the North Atlantic Council are sufficiently seized of the urgency to do this now, given that we are 9 months on from Cardiff, Wales, Newport, wherever it was?
Well, we're in NATO, and we are quite confident that the people, our colleagues, are well apprised.
That means yes.
And can I just push back very briefly, Nick? It's a tremendously important distinction, which I think your survey blurred, Bruce, because there's a lot of people in Germany and France and other countries who have this Orientalist perspective on the East. They think East Europeans are nationalist and unpredictable and will get into fights. And so if you say, will you support these countries if they get into a conflict? Well, they think, well, who started it? If you ask them, will you defend your ally if your ally is attacked? I think you would have got a different question. And it worries me that this Pew survey result is...
But you're not listening to the question identifies Russia as the aggressor.
Gets into a conflict with Russia is what it said. It didn't say if Russia attacks.
Is Carl Georg, where is Carl Georg here? Please, why don't I come to you? Because, one moment, Jonathan. Yeah, because you made this point, coming from the Bundestag.
I just want to make very clear that the vast majority of the Germans, over 80%, are behind their government. And there's no doubt about the position of that government. I mean, we're doing permanently the air policing in the Baltic states. We supported Newport. We definitely say NATO must be strong and do more for the Eastern allies. I just want to tell a very small story.
But just be very careful. Just let's be very clear. Given that this time last year, German public opinion was pretty soft, are you sufficiently convinced now it is hardened to the point where, from the Chancellery and through the Bundestag, you could make a deployment decision? Because a lot of what's going to happen is going to happen with German support.
I think so, yes. I think so, yes. But let me tell you one issue. I was asked by Polish journalists, why aren't you doing more concerning Eastern Ukraine? Is it like 1938, when the appeasement politicians Chamberlain gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler to try to please him? And I said, are you prepared to stand in front of your public, of your young men, and say, we'll send you to Donbass to fight against Russia? That's a very complicated question. We need to do everything. We, as foreign politicians, are obliged to try to initiate a political process together with Russia. That's at the end. We have to make very clear where the red lines are, no doubt. And if they cross the border of any Eastern ally of the NATO, member of the ally, then we have war, definitely. That we must make very clear and deploy NATO troops, equipment, wherever necessary.
But can I just press you? Those you represent, Carl Georg, when you have this discussion with them, do they understand how serious potentially this could be, and they're prepared to sign up to it and support you?
Well, we have experience with Russia. I was born in West Berlin, and I know very well that 1/3 of Germany had been occupied by the Russians for 50, 60 years. We know very well about the Russians, about the Russian character. So nobody has to teach
But political support, those you represent?
Yes, I'm very sure.
Okay, Jonathan Isle, please, who else wants to come in? No, get Jonathan Isle first. No, please, first there. Sorry, I'm being too fast. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Returning to Article 5, I think...
We're going to stay on Article 5 now for the moment, Jonathan.
Right. Most of the Russian military maneuvers are not actually intended to probe Article 5 as such, but to paralyze the decision-making mechanism of NATO if Article 5 is invoked. To push us perhaps to discuss as an Article 4 issue rather than an Article 5. So the key question is not to redraft the Washington Treaty, but to redraft the internal decision-making procedures in NATO in order to ensure that Article 5 decisions are either taken semi-automatically or in a way that is compelling for existing member states. That's what we're going to be tested on, the validity of Article 5 in terms of application.
Strategies and scenarios. I think it's fair to say that General Bartels, head of the military committee, and also Breedlove are now more convinced that they would get that level of spontaneity if they needed it, correct? Yes. Okay. Right, who's got it over there? Who's got the microphone, please? Let's stay, please, on Article 5. Be disciplined about this, please.
Yes, I'd like to make a comment about the result of the Pew research in France and Germany. I think in France and Germany, these are the only two NATO countries where you have two former leaders, Mr. Schröder in Germany and Sarkozy in France, who are playing demagogically with the Kremlin's opinion and the Kremlin's arguments when they speak to the public. And I think it is... Yeah, Schröder, but Sarkozy compared a month ago, Nicolas Sarkozy compared a month ago the takeover of Crimea with Kosovo, which is exactly what the Kremlin wants to do, plus a series of journalists who have been playing those games too, in these two countries.
Let's stay on Article 5, please, because then I can keep the stovepipes and the level of argument clear. Can you move it on to whoever is going to talk about Article 5, please, over there?
I want to talk a bit about this grey zone, whether it's Article 5 or not. And the president of Estonia mentioned this point that Russians in Estonia see, that Russia, life in Russia is much worse in Estonia. They wouldn't want to join Russia. But I think that underestimates the ability of Putin and this KGB clique to engineer a threat to ethnic Russians in Estonia, emanating supposedly from fascist ultranationalists in Estonia. We already see some, on the Facebook groups multiplying in lousy Estonian, claiming to be Estonian nationalists, calling for almost ethnic cleansing and all sorts of things. And I know of some young ethnic Russians in northeast of Estonia who are afraid to go to study to Tartu University, the premier university in Estonia, because they say, well, they are nationalists, they're beating up Russians in Tartu. That's the perception we are dealing with, and Putin and his KGB clique are perfectly capable of exploiting this and faking up, engineering a crisis where the Russians feel they're under attack, from fascists or whoever, that their lives are threatened, and they will be up in arms. We'll have an insurgency, which is it Article 5? Probably not. Article 4? Maybe. Is Alliance able and willing to come and assist in this kind of a situation? I don't know.
All right, well, remember what Carl Bildt said. He said this kind of thing would not be discussed in the European Union, so it takes a meeting like this, a conference or a think tank, to send out a message. What is the message going to be? Who's going to talk about Article 5? Then I'm going to move on at some point. Who's got the microphone, please? Article 5.
Sorry, I'm a NATO official, so I have to defend NATO. I want to use 3 examples.
No, you have to be realistic.
No, of course we're realistic. That's what
no
we
one's
do.
No one's criticizing NATO. We're analyzing
I want to use
5.
3 examples, which we have done it. They're not theoretical, they're real. September 11, it took us 12 hours. 12 hours only to discuss whether Article 5 should be activated. First time in history, and it was not the most obvious scenario, as everyone knows. 12 hours, we did it. Second example, last year, as maybe most, but maybe not everybody knows in this room, it was actually a political decision that cyber attack could activate Article 5. It's a major policy decision. Third example, although there was no Article 5 situation, but there was a fear there could be one, it didn't take us that long to place Patriots in Turkey in view of that threat. So in other words, I think our record, we can debate the future and the scenarios of which we don't know, but I think I wanted to make that point because NATO is quite flexible, and the nations, of course, are not, they know what the business is about, and I'm quite sure just because some soldiers would take off the insignia, we will recognize an attack if you were to come against a NATO nation.
Just before you sit down and hand the microphone on, though, but for you as an official inside, you can feel a smartness and a readiness were there to be an immediate need to do something because of something surprise. And we heard from yesterday from Sandy Veshbau, he raised the spectre of denial of access at one point. Now that could happen amazingly quickly.
Yes, but we can also debate this amazingly quickly, and of course we're improving our capabilities to look ahead. So I think we're in much better position to analyze and therefore act. And another weakness, you said be realistic, which we identified, which is the decision-making system process in member states. That's not for NATO to address, but it's to be raised by NATO, and something is being done, it's being discussed in the member states. Otherwise,
And do you believe that Russia gets that now?
Well, I have worked in Russia 4.5 years as a head of a NATO office there. I think they don't want to believe that, or they certainly want to send a message that is not the case, but they are wrong.
Okay, thank you. Who else would like? You want to talk about Article 5? Let's keep it on Article 5 for the moment. Just wait a minute.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm also a member of German Parliament, and I fully agree to that what my colleague Karl-Georg Wellman said. Everybody in our parliament knows that Article 5 is carved in stone. And we all know if a Russian soldier or something like that would try to test NATO in this way, that he tries to cross a NATO border, that would mean that Article 5 would be in action. And if not, that would be the end of NATO. We all know this. And therefore, there is a clear message from Germany, from us all, that we stand together and that we know that only in unity there is strength, and others is not visible. And I think that is right what Humboldt said, without security there is no freedom. Everybody in Germany knows this, and I think you can see that is a clear position of the German parliament.
Thank you very much. Who's got the microphone over there? Please.
Yeah,
I should tell you that there will be a dinner session about little green men tonight. I don't know whether they're attending, but there is a session about little green men. Please.
Yeah. Andreas Umland, Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in Kiev. I think the discussion we are now having is exactly the discussion which Putin wants us to have. We are discussing Article 4, Article 5, the Baltics, Poland. We are not discussing Moldovan elections. We are not discussing the Ukrainian economy. We are not discussing Mariupol, Abkhazia. This is exactly what he wants us to be. He wants us to be scared. I think the main prey is here Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. This is what this is about. And all this discussion here about a NATO-Russia war is, I think, bogus.
Well, we are, but don't put the microphone down. We are discussing, and what message do you think should go from here then? Take the microphone back, can you?
Yeah, I think we should just focus on what Putin is up to, and I think, I mean, there's a game going on here of scaring us, of distracting us. This is all part of the information war,
right?
And we are becoming victims of that.
Right. What do you think, panel, about this? That we're actually talking about the wrong issue here, Foreign Minister.
Article 5 over. It's already discussed. Yeah, Article 5.
No, not at all. No. I'm merely saying that that intervention said. This is exactly what Russia would like us to be talking about, but there are other things we should be talking about.
I believe now we should talk about all things what are relevant. I agree with a colleague who said that we sometimes catched like on the hook, and talking about things which are important, but we're not talking about not less important things. But in my view, we have to respect the rules of that talks, of these discussions, and there should be some really rules of engagement, frankly speaking, because we are playing the same game but different rules.
What do you think we should be talking about?
We should be talking about everything with Russia, but this dialogue and cooperation should be based on concrete values and commitments, and we cannot be silent when these values are violated. For instance, again coming about Mariupol, Eastern Ukraine, permanent member of Security Council, the council which is supposed to stay on guard of peace structure in the world, conducting aggression with neighboring country, denying obvious things, and this is a precedent. It's not just happening in that part of Europe. This is precedent in the world affairs, and we cannot be silent. Also, Russia very like to claim, so to say, monopoly defending important values. For instance, let's mention in this room the value of fight with fascism. Who can, so to say, be neutral in this fight or condemning the fascism? Nobody. But when we're talking about events which are hosted in Moscow by radical neo-fascist parties, we are silent because it's not comfortable to talk about. So let's be consistent. Let's speak up. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk. Of course we have to talk, but we should follow rules. We're not following these rules, or forgetting, or at whatever expense, for national interests, economic interests, This is exactly something what is very wrong in the process.
Sergei, what do you think about whether we're talking about the things Putin would like us to talk about?
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely share this view, and I said in my initial remarks that Putin is not facing NATO countries. He is not ready to have a minor chance of war with NATO. It's a disaster. He's not in favor of war. He's in favor of neighbors. He's in favor of neighbors, and in my view, what we have to discuss is what is Ukraine? Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Belarus all together. Are the European alliance, is Europe responsible for their security? Is Europe responsible for their national identity or not? Is Europe ends at the border of Poland, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, or Europe is somewhere else? And that's why in April last year I had a discussion with the White House officials as events in eastern Ukraine emerged, and they asked me, what should we do? My answer was, okay, please send 1,000 paratroopers to the eastern Ukraine, everything is finished in 5 days. Okay, nowadays, let's draw a black scenario. Let's imagine Ukrainian reforms fail 1 year from now. I don't know for what reason. Let's imagine the President Poroshenko is dismissed by the decision of the parliament once again, as Yanukovych was dismissed. He is dismissed. And Ukraine is not capable to run new presidential elections because economy is collapsed, government is collapsed, everything is collapsing. In this situation, Putin sees another opportunity. There is no power in Ukraine. Let's grab. Let's build Novorossiya. Let's build road to Crimea. And it will be too late for European Union, for NATO, for the United States to react to this situation. All policy of the West towards Russia, towards Russian military intentions, is reactive. My point of view is Europe, West, should be preemptive. Okay, send paratroopers, send military personnel to the eastern Ukraine on the Ukrainian territory. Yes, yes, not a lot, 2,000, 3,000 people, but it should be, Ukraine should be a line of Europe. Ukraine, NATO should take responsibility to protect, but remember Budapest Memorandum, protect Ukrainian national identity, protect European state. That's what we have to discuss, not NATO. NATO is very important. Of course, NATO has to discuss, is cyber attack is a violation of Article 5, are green men without insignia a violation of Article 5? It's very important. But much more important is the destiny of Ukraine and all other countries between Europe and Russia.
Carl Bildt, is the West misleading itself? In other words, being sucked into the issue of relations with NATO and Article 5 and really should be focusing on other things?
I think we need to focus on all of these things, although I do agree with what's being said. I don't think Putin would voluntarily, deliberately go to war with NATO. Not that he necessarily fears NATO, he fears the US. I mean, it's really the US it's all about. He is convinced that the US is against him and against Russia as it is, but he doesn't want to go to war with the US. And he knows that the United States has the military resources to react very fast. It's the only country that has that ability. It has the ability to escalate horizontally, which is extremely dangerous for him. I mean, Narva is not only defended in Narva, Narva is defended all over the world. And they can also escalate vertically, and he's very much aware of that. He will not do that if he can avoid it, in my opinion. But he will play the game. And he will, if there are opportunities, he will do them elsewhere. I agree, but the thing that worries me at the moment, as we speak, is the government crisis in Moldova. Because that could easily go wrong, and that can present opportunities. And if that sort of turns Moldova around, there's elections, and he's working with the different minorities there and things like that, then, yeah, Moldova is to the west of Ukraine. And that's going to have quite an impact if it happens. It's a small place, but it's located in a fairly strategic place.
Do you think that the European Union, NATO, are seized of this possibility now?
Have you seen any signs of that I missed?
No, but that's why I'm asking it rhetorically, because I thought you might have a better insight.
No, but I've been also saying to sort of relevant people that at the moment you should send a senior foreign minister or commissioner or whatever to Chisinau and see what you can do.
And the reaction has been?
And the reaction, some say, well, we shouldn't interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. I mean, these are partners. others are doing it, why shouldn't we do it? I think I want to support you here, or we haven't.
Foreign Minister, have you been invited to go? Have you been invited to go?
Sometimes on my own without
yeah,
invitation.
But he doesn't normally need invitations.
No, we're in touch on this issue, also with them, believe me.
I mean, these sorts of issues. Then, just to add to that, I mean, I think it was very interesting there was a lot of interesting figures, but one that is, of course, worrying for a lot of people is that 60% of the Russians say that there are parts of other countries that should belong to us. But we should not forget that the places where people get most nervous about that is one, Astana, and second, Minsk. Those are the places that are, from that point of view, most dangerous. And there we go to the question of the Eurasia Union. You can see how ambivalent they are about this particular project, because they know that that is a project for Russian domination, and they are dependent. They are where they are. They are dependent upon Russia. They have historical links, all of those things. They can never be like Portugal. That's simply not conceivable. But they don't want to be taken over by the Kremlin. They don't want to be sort of their independent sovereignty threatened by it.
Let's get another perspective on this. Mikhail Saakashvili, you've just arrived, I think, and you are now the governor of Odessa.
Yes.
So you've made a number of very interesting decisions politically. What is your assessment of what the West's scenarios and strategies should now be, given what you went through in 2008?
Well, to pick on what Carl said about Moldova. Now, I think very few people are paying attention at what the Putin strategy might be in our part of Ukraine, which is very strategic, more basically with the IDPs, more than 3.something million population, larger than Belgium, and we are talking about Bessarabia. Now, Ukrainian Bessarabia is connected with this part of Odessa region and the rest of Ukraine with two bridges, one of which is semi-destroyed, another one can be easily blown up. Ukraine has very little forces in Bessarabia, very bad roads, and and very mixed population. What we are seeing now in Moldova is that Russians have managed to have their Bashkan in Gagauzia, and big part of Bessarabia are Gagauz ethnically. They are, of course, encroaching from Transnistria. They just won local elections in Moldova. There's a fair chance that they might if it continues like this, overthrow pro-Western coalition in Moldova and take over with clearly pro-Russian forces. And then Ukraine will get surrounded from the north, and the threat will be that also from the west, from Romania side, our part. And we are talking about, and this is interesting because it's all interconnected, because who is the leader of this project in the Kremlin? Who is running under Surkov the project Bessarabia? No other but Inal Ardzimba. And who is Inal Ardzimba? Son of Vladislav Ardzimba, historic head of Abkhaz separatists who fought war against Georgia in the 90s. And now his son sits in the Kremlin, meet Putin from time to time. Putin is very much focused on this Bessarabia project. And I don't see any Europeans really focusing on Bessarabia. I don't see any development projects of Bessarabia. We've seen, some lip service to Donetsk projects, but, once conflict is there, it's late.
What happens when you try to raise this?
No, because we need roads now there. We need the European project now. And when you talk to European ambassadors there, they say, well, our project can realistically start in 18 months, and if you want it faster, you need political decision. And nobody else is paying political attention to it. And in 18 months, it will be too late. We are seeing, and if Odessa district is surrounded from the west and the north, it will not be Mariupol only. Putin is not after Mariupol, I assure you. He wants the whole rest of the Black Sea coast. Odessa is the pinnacle of his whatever Novorossiya project, which is not that. He hasn't given it up, and he wants to, in this or other way, control this part of Ukraine.
So what is the scenario and strategy which we should be considering here or putting on the table?
I think it's right now, really, it's not about troops. It's the development might really work. We need tons of money bringing in. We need we need roads. We need water sewage system. It will cost it's much less than what it will cost once it erupts. We are talking about region of roughly, Bessarabia is roughly 400,000 people, but a very strategic one. like 60 or 75 or 80 kilometers of Black Sea coast, beginning of Danube, and basically up to 85 kilometers.
Right. Well, can I just ask
Yeah.
you to pause there? There are many other questions we'd like to ask you, given your new
Sure.
job. But let's leave it there for the moment, as we only have 20 minutes to run. Is there anyone here from the European Union, or from anyone inside, who could talk about what Mr. Saakashvili has just raised, the issue of we need money, we need development aid in order. We've been talking about kinetic, we've been talking about military, but there's another way forward. Well, Foreign Minister, is this on the agenda of the European Council? Is this something which month by month you're considering?
It is discussed, it is also provided, but not to the extent which is needed, in my view. I'm convinced, and what colleague
Well,
says...
Linas, we don't have European money at all in that region. I can
in the
assure
region,
you.
yeah.
That region will be the
generally.
next to blow up if we don't get one. I mean, that's so simple.
Yeah, not
With
in the
zero
region.
European
All
money.
right, we got the
they
message.
They are telling me about 3 million that
All right, we got
Canadians might be providing.
I'm trying to find out. I'm trying to find out how much resonance there is on that point.
I'm talking about whole Ukraine, definitely not about the region.
Yeah.
That's the point. And I also agree that it's not sufficient. I also have to say that we should not only provide assistance in terms of money, but also know-how, expertise, and we should send people to work with that. What we're doing in Lithuania, by the way, we're sending them. You can find not one and not two Lithuanian faces, even in the government, which is also quite risky. We're also criticized by some politicians in Ukraine that it shouldn't be like that. But I believe we have to do that because we really, if we'll not do in parallel some efforts in fighting corruption, not only in Odessa region but everywhere, which is really still a problem for people, for perception, we really cannot make our assistance efficient, and this is really the case. Let me add you this opportunity that I'm really convinced that we have to support Ukraine in all terms, also in military terms. I'm not saying about sending troops. Maybe for the exercises, indeed, this footprint could help psychologically, but we should support army of Ukraine. Because those were talking about peaceful solution, and there were also some questions, I believe, in the beginning. It sounds very convincing, peaceful solution, diplomatic solution, but when we're not supporting army of Ukraine, we are frankly for a Russian military solution, which is also not a peaceful. Of course, peace will come when they will destroy Ukrainian army. Is it that peace we would like to see? And this is really, they are withstanding aggression from outside against the army, which is better equipped than some European armies, we know quite well. And the accumulation of this equipment, heavy equipment, tanks, missiles, is such a huge amount, and we still believe that this is kind of fragmented approach. So this is exactly not only economic but also military aspect.
Carl Bildt, that very important point there, made by someone who's got a real deep concern about a place like Odessa, needing development assistance. Otherwise, there'll be a slide which he's just laid out, a scenario which is really bleak, but the kind of thing which you say has been on the agenda probably for about 18 months, is well aware, Brussels is well aware of this. Is there a political mood to actually understand that as another option in the Russia crisis?
Well, I hope there is, and I wouldn't say that this has necessarily been the focus, but some efforts have been made. There is money there, Misha. I mean, there's Swedish money, I can tell you, not too much, but there is, because I've been there X numbers of times in Odessa and looked at it. And we've been engaged with Moldova. We have done quite a lot with Moldova, by the way. The DCFTA, the visa freedom, but the Russians have been playing the minorities card, and they've been playing other cards that are very dangerous. Transnistria is in a difficult situation, by the way. Its economy is going down quite substantially because they can't sort of subsidize it to the same extent any longer. And the fact that the DCFTA and the visa freedom has had an effect of attracting people from Transnistria. We also have, there are Russian troops there, but there's also, and that's been successful, we have an EU border monitoring mission that is there, based in Odessa, by the way, which has been quite substantial in getting some of the worst of the corruption trade under control. I'm not saying that these are enough, but, and I certainly agree, I brought it up, but this area is of a strategic importance, because if that goes wrong to the west of the rest of Ukraine, it will substantially impact upon our possibility to succeed with the rest of Ukraine. So more attention needs to be given.
And Sergei, given that you worked in the finance ministry, what would be the impact if there were to be a much more considered and decisive sort of investment by the West, whoever it is, the European Union, in a place like Odessa, to do the kind of things that Mr. Saakashvili has just mentioned?
I understand very well that there are enormous bureaucratic obstacles to do this, because
But the
Odessa,
political signal, the political signal.
Odessa is a very important strategic region, but no one international organization deals with a region inside the country. So normally, government to the international organization, World Bank, European Union, NATO, it's government-oriented business. So, Misha, lobby in Kiev. Lobby in Kiev, not in Brussels.
No. Kiev has no money now for that.
A lobby in Kiev to support regional projects in Odessa.
No. But it's not about Odessa. I spoke about Bessarabia, which is Romania's border, and I think it's the EU's interest.
You should lobby Kiev to Kiev lobby in Brussels, money from Brussels to Bessarabia.
But what about the way that would be read in Moscow, given we're talking about strategies and scenarios? Is this a robust response, which would be...
Look, once again, it will be response. Even if we start immediately this project to get European financial support to Bessarabia, it will take, 18 months. If Putin has this idea, if political crisis in Moldova is widespread emerging immediately, new elections and new governors, and it may happen in days or weeks. So it's a time schedule. The problem is that Putin, as an opportunistic politician, as a one-man show who decides everything, he may make decision any day. Bureaucracy is making decision in months. Moreover, if decision is unpredictable, unusual, and if it's not about NATO. Look, Bessarabia is somewhere, we don't know where it is.
Let me just ask one other question. There are several representatives from Asia here, and 3 questions I think we had earlier about Asia and the way this should be read in Asia, and the fact that this is very much a European issue at the moment. What about the far more global issue, all of you, before we end? Foreign Minister.
It's important to have dialogue with Asia, with some countries, and ASEAN countries are very important. I believe we have to be more involved also in the regional cooperations with these countries. We are not doing that enough and sufficiently. But when it comes to the organizations like Shanghai Organization, for instance, or like so to say, when we're talking about relations with Eurasian Union, it's also Asian aspect. They are of different nature. And especially Eurasian Union, in our view, it's an organization of different nature. Same as we were talking in NATO, by the way, about relations with CSTO, this organization also former Soviet space. We were reluctant to have this partnership because of different nature. We do not want censorship by somebody in the way of our relations with some countries of the region. Same to be said about Eurasian Union. So there are a lot of aspects should be addressed, and you cannot have the single approach. But in general terms, I believe we are not doing enough. We are not paying enough attention, that's true. And we have to make full use of our potential in this region and whatever aspects that will be taken.
Carl Bildt, the assertiveness and the relationships with Asia. I mean, after all, China is looking hard at what Russia's doing. And there are significant regional issues which could easily blow up in the way that what we're seeing in Eastern Europe has happened.
And I think we should be more active in the diplomatic political dialogue with different Asian countries and with others as well, who have been slightly ambivalent. Because on the one hand, they say, well, we don't want everything to be dominated by the Americans, and if the Russians are against the Americans, we can give it at least some support. I mean, you find that tendency even more if you go to Latin America, I would say, than you see in Asia. China. With China, we should say to them even more clearly than we do, that the most important message that China always has to us is that we should respect their core interest, which is territorial integrity. And accordingly, they should support territorial integrity in Europe. But at the same time, they have this tendency that, well, it's not necessarily a bad idea if greater powers have more powers and rights against small powers. And that if great powers feel that they can do something against small powers in their vicinity, it might not necessarily be something that we Chinese are against.
Because there's a question here, there's no name attached to it. Is Russia's revisionism localized to Eastern Europe or more comprehensive? Similarly, the destabilization is concerning throughout the world, not just Europe. Much as European states came to the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore a few days ago to seek greater engagement and involvement, how can the states of Asia assist in any way to return stability and peace to Europe? Can that happen? Can it be useful?
Absolutely they can. In the diplomatic sense, in order to be sort of as firm as they should be on the respect for the existing borders, that should be a sort of fundamental interest to every Asian state, be that Yeah, absolutely, and that is important in order sort of, again, diplomatically to block. Then Japan is always helpful when it comes to money as well, as has to be said, also in terms of Ukraine. That is important, but the political engagement, us Europeans explaining what is happening to an international audience that is somewhat confused sometimes over these issues.
We're almost at the end. Would you like to, Japanese ambassador, would you like to just comment on that, please? Yes, please. Ishi-san from
Thank you.
Brussels.
As I repeatedly said, what Ukraine issue touched was the basic principle of international relations, no unilateral change of the status quo by force. So I do hope European countries will push that issue to China as well. And I'm 100% sure that China doesn't like to see what happened in Ukraine happening in their backyard, in Xinjiang or Tibet. So they should be able to sign to that. They should be able to sign to that when they deal with South China Sea as well. That's what I hope, and that's where Europe can help. Just another point is that our fate is militarily interrelated as well. Right after Ukraine, our self-defense force had to scramble almost 3 times per day against Russia. 3 times per day. So the heightened of military operation did not only happen in Europe, but also in Asia.
You represent Japan in Brussels. Before you leave the microphone, is that voice being listened to from Japan in Brussels or not?
I think NATO knows this.
Good, okay. Who else wanted to come in, please?
Asked about the Chinese position. There's a very diverse.
Do you want to tell us where you're from?
One way from the Renmin University of China, Beijing. Okay, of course, my personal views. You know, China, there are so many Chinese. It's a very diverse, very controversial about the Ukraine crisis. But the Chinese government position is we support the territorial unity of Ukraine. 1992, when China built diplomatic relations with Ukraine, this said very clearly in a communique. At the same time, we understand the Russia's response, that we views of the Russian response is not just the relation between Russia and Ukraine and Europe, but more from the Russians' relations with NATO and the US expansion. Most of the Chinese think about this NATO expansion narrowed the space, not respect the core national interests of the Russia. So Russia has to take the Crimea because this is the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. So I think the Chinese think about that is from the Cold War. It's a more long years.
Do you think Beijing is looking very closely at every move and every reaction from Russia?
Of course.
Thank you.
You know, but I would like to make 2 additional comments. Firstly, China is not Russia. Our DNA, culture, history is different. So we will not follow the steps of Russia.
Okay.
Secondly, but we look closely how the West, particularly the United States and NATO, to deal with Russia. You said 1991 collapse, comfortable, and then if you're democratic, they will treat you very well. They let you join the G7, G8, but still it's unequal. So who can trust you?
Right. I'm gonna, forgive me, I'm gonna have to close this. We were never going to cover every single issue, but my goodness, we've got through an enormous amount. I've got one final question, which is question 4 here on the app. If you can put that up for the last 3 or 4 minutes for all 3 of you. This comment from Fred Tanner. Listening to the disquieting debate on Russia and European security, I wonder if there remains any space for diplomacy and dialogue, which at the end of the day are essential to prevent sleepwalking into a major war on the European continent. Given that Sandy Veshbal can confirm there are still contacts on a formal basis with Russia, what's your response to that and the dangers that are highlighted there by Fred? Minister.
There is space for the contacts, for the dialogue. It's going on. We are talking. And I'm only think I'm saying that there are rules also for the dialogue, and we have to respect these rules. That's important condition. The rest, I believe, it's possible, and no one is going to wage war. No one is going to increase tension, and it's no intention of member states as well. In particular, let me mention Lithuania as a neighboring country, small country with really would like to have good relations with Russia, and I hope we will have good relations in the future, but not at any expense. There should be conditions fulfilled, and this is the must and the condition for these contacts which are taking place. And also, let me add, we shouldn't waste time for this too official and too public, too visible contacts which are gaining no results but creating impression of business as usual.
Sergei, diplomacy and dialogue rather than much of what we've been talking about today.
I believe that definitely there is a space for dialogue, moreover if we are looking for the long-term future. But I think that the dialogue should be run against the problem how to build the future European security organization, European security structure, including Russia. Because what we had until recently, it was European security structure, exclusive Russia. It was NATO plus Russia. So still was a dividing line. NATO is on the one side of the river, Russia is on the other side. If we want to avoid the Cold War for the next, I don't know, generations or centuries, Russia, after Putin, I don't know, should be incorporated in European security structures, and these plans should be developed today and put on the table for the discussions.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Carl Bildt, finally, conflicting evidence, conflicting information, conflicting signals. Here we are speaking with St. Petersburg summit going on, Putin making a great play with the Greeks. At the same time as a few days ago, he announced that another 40 intercontinental ballistic missiles would be delivered.
Which was 10 less than they had planned. So they have.
So they can't build the other 10.
Well, I mean, these are complicated things.
All right. So your final thought, please, as we wind this up.
My final thought is that we are in a confused situation. You are right. We need to do all of these things that you indicate. I mean, the military preparedness, the information warfare, or whatever you call it, and the diplomatic engagement in order to try to explore the options that there might be. Let me just put finally on the table an idea that I have that is absolutely hopeless, a non-starter at the moment, but at some point might be, and that is to deploy a peacekeeping force in Donbass. The Minsk agreement cannot be implemented without a substantial international presence, and what's happening in Donbass, at the end of the day, I think might even be a greater threat to Moscow than to Kiev, because we have a criminalized gang of gangsters ruling over desperate 2 million people with a decaying economy. And these people feel, at some point in time, I think they will be more angry with Moscow having betrayed them, because Moscow indicated that Moscow was going to deliver more, and turn against Moscow.
All right, well, it's a pity you didn't put that on the agenda a bit earlier.
Peacekeeping force in Donbass in order to, at some point in time, achieve a solution.
All right, let's have a surprise debate about a peacekeeping force in Donbass. But thank you all very much indeed. This has been a kind of hybrid panel in the sense that it's been you as much as the three here, and of course Bruce as well. Can I thank you all very much indeed? I'm sure some of you are frustrated, but I hope we've shed light on some of these very critical issues, and I hope I've got as many voices as possible from all parts of the world, which has made it as effective as I think it has felt in the last 2 hours. Can I tell you the next session is in here at 2:45 on energy, so please be back here from lunch sharply. Thank you.